So I'm just going to go ahead and get started here, and you can all kind of filter in. My name is Jeff Mount. I'm a senior fellow here at PPIC, or at PPIC. We hold our regular events here. Today we're going to present a report that we just posted online here, A Path Forward for California's Freshwater Ecosystems. I do want to tell you that on each of your chair you have the agenda and the summary for policymakers. We try very hard to put these into things that people who have either short attention span or very limited time, sometimes both, can actually see the conclusions of the report and get through the conclusions real quickly. There are, if at the end you would like a hard copy, you want to talk to somebody in the back about this, getting a hard copy. Otherwise, this is available online at our website. And before I start, I want to make clear that there are two sources of funding for this. The S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation helped fund this, and also a new fellowship that we have at PPIC, and this is the Caltrout Ecosystem Fellowship, currently held by one of the co-authors, Ted Grantham. There are 13 of us, 13 co-authors on this, and I'm not going to go through the list of co-authors, so you all can look at that. There are a number of them here that are in the room, including our crack legal team. The entire legal team is here, so if you got a problem with the law, take it up with them. And this is, of course, led by Brian Gray and has Kerrigan Bork and Jennifer Harters on that. So they are here as well. And also want to call out a special thanks to one individual that I haven't had a chance to thank, and that's Nat Seavey, who's sitting there quietly trying to be invisible eating his lunch. Nat had the gall to change jobs in the middle of this project, so he was not able to see it to the end, but he was incredibly important within it. So in today's program, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very brief, rapid fire summary of the conclusions. I encourage you to take a look at the report. There are some gems in there. I take no responsibility for the gems. There are some interesting and controversial ideas within it as well. But I'm just going to summarize those findings, and then we're going to give it up to Letitia Grenier, who's from SFEI, and she's going to run a panel here where we will have some discussions about this concept of ecosystem-based management and how it would work. We're going to do Q&A. We're going to set aside about 15 minutes for Q&A, but we're not going to do a y'all shout Q&A because we are streaming online, and it's important that people hear those questions. So you will see someone with a microphone. That's how you get to do the Q side of Q&A. You got to grab a microphone. And then finally, we value these things, and you ignore them, but it's really important. We will hit you with a survey later. You'll receive a short survey. Please take a few moments to fill it out. They help us, and even if it's I didn't like the cookies, it's helpful for us as we plan these things. And then finally, the single most important thing, and I see a couple of you doing that right now, silence your cell phones. And I'm probably the one who's going to be the one that's going to. I should probably do as I say and as I do. There we go. Okay, so let me start this. This is a really quick background to this report. We have now for some years been writing about this issue of ecosystem-based management, and we use this phrase all the time. And in the last report we did in 2017, there's some copies back there where we looked at basically, we took some lessons from the drought and ecosystem management during the drought. We said the state really has to switch over to ecosystem-based management, and we were called out by a couple of people afterwards who said, what the hell do you mean by that? I mean, everybody nods their heads and say, oh yeah, we got to do that, but what do you mean by that? So this is the paper where we try and spell that out and how it would work and how it would look in practice and whether or not we can even do it, whether it's even legal or not. So the general outline for this talk is I'm just going to make the case, and I don't think it'll be hard to sell here that the current approach for ecosystem management is not working. There are some what we are proposing is an alternative way forward, an alternative path, and that is the concept of freshwater ecosystem-based management. I'll define what that means. I will very briefly cover the legal basis. There is a wonderful appendix to this report, and you almost never hear those phrases together, wonderful and appendix, because there's a reason it's in the appendix. But this is actually a terrific legal analysis led by Brian Gray on whether or not ecosystem-based management, how it would work within the law, and I will allude to that. I will tell you we are making a lot of progress on this, and we're going to hear from panelists today who are people who are actually making that progress. Heather Dyer, in particular, from San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, is going to be talking about some of the work that she's been doing, and Allie Forsythe as well. And the Venerable Lester Snow will be here also to explain things to us. And then finally, we're going to end up with a suggestion, sort of how to organize this under sustainable watershed management plans. First of all, here's why it's not working. And this is my abbreviated version. You can look at the paper itself. And it's all, you can look at the fight between the Newsom administration and the Trump administration over the biops in the Delta right now. What are they fighting about? Okay, what they're fighting about is something that rightfully the Newsom administration says a binary. I mean, it is a trade-off between water supply and endangered species, and specifically 2 species. So they're missing in that fight, and this is in using these biops as leverage for managing the environment. They're missing the rest of the system. There are broad economic, social, and environmental benefits associated with healthy ecosystems. And we can argue about the definition of healthy ecosystems, usually with my biologist friends, like Peter Moyle, in particular. We argue about what that actually means, but I'm going to tell you what I think I mean by that, and that's ecosystem condition. The second thing that's going on is Jeanette Howard from the Nature Conservancy led a very interesting study a few years back in which it looked at the condition of just native biodiversity at writ large in freshwater ecosystems. Ted Grantham was one of the co-authors on that paper. And what you see is a long-term downward trend in native biodiversity, that we're not listing all these species. And in fact, the number of species that are now vulnerable, that you would identify as vulnerable, maybe 10 years ago you'd worry about them as being vulnerable, they're not listed. And they're many more times than they're currently listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act and California Endangered Species Act. So what we're seeing is broad decline in ecosystem condition, which is affecting native biodiversity. And we will argue, and we argue in this paper, is also affecting the multiple uses that we get from these ecosystems. So that's trouble on the horizon and something we need to think about. But the fact is, with over-reliance on the use of the ESA as the prime hammer and or lever for environmental management misses all of that. Because the ESA is very weak on trying to worry about climate change, changing conditions, anticipating future listings of species and decline of species. It is reactive or emergency room treatment of a narrow problem. But we continue to rely too heavily upon it. So we're arguing we should not do that in this. And the alternative is what we and many people around the world call ecosystem-based management. And ecosystem-based management, the primary objective is not listed species. The primary objective is not water supply. It's a broader set of objectives, but you're managing toward ecosystem condition. And it is the condition of that and we look at a variety of things like structure and function, and we describe that in detail in the report and what it looks like, but you're really managing it toward an ecosystem condition. So instead of species, instead of a single use, an extractive use of that ecosystem, you're managing to the ecosystem itself. And this approach, where it's adapted around the world, focuses on basically integrating human uses into the overall planning and setting ecosystem objectives, ecosystem condition objectives. And obviously, in doing so, emphasizes multiple benefits. And the argument is made, and Letitia did this when we were writing this thing, we kept pointing out, your net benefits are larger. Now, it may be that some of the traditional uses do not have net benefits from this approach, but the broader benefits to society are much larger. And where they do it well, it reduces water conflict. So the key is, when we sat down and we looked at it and said, well, what would this look like in practice? And this is, I think, is very useful because this is a very abstract concept, but what would it look like in practice? And we basically broke this down into two groups. The first thing we did is planning and governance. And for multiple years now in projects that we've done from PPIC, we have been pointing out plans matter. Eisenhower was right. Actually, no, he didn't say that. He said, what is it? Plans are nothing, planning is everything, is what he said. But it really matters that the planning part does. And so we looked at what does it take to do planning and governance for ecosystem-based management. And what we first and foremost is you have to bring the beneficiaries into the room so that they know they are beneficiaries and have a stake in the outcome. And you have to define that ecosystem condition. Metrics and performance measures are the quantitative measure of what you think you want out of this ecosystem. So they're extremely important. Places where this is working well all have robust collaborative scientific programs. It's not some group that does some monitoring on the side and reports every year, but it's actually quite collaborative and helps guide management. And what's really important about this, where it's done well, is regulatory alignment. And that is, you have, I know I'm preaching to the choir in this one, and we have a tremendous amount of overlap and sometimes conflict between the various local, state, and federal agencies, which are in charge of managing our freshwater ecosystems and what we take from them. Done well, these actually align the agency actions under a single umbrella. And within those are comprehensive agreements. I'll come back to that in a second, but this is extremely important. And these are binding agreements amongst the water user community, stakeholders group, and the agencies. And oh, by the way, it wouldn't be a PPIC report if we didn't also mention funding. The funding for this is extremely important. Without reliable funding, and this is beyond bond funding, without reliable funding, it doesn't work. At the same time, you can't just say, okay, we've got this great project, and then go around and do piecemeal management of using the basic tools that are available for ecosystem-based management. And at the top of the list is something we've been pushing for some years now here, and that is the notion that we need to start making an allocation, a set-aside of water for the environment. And these we call ecosystem water budgets that function like a senior water right, so that you can store, that you can trade, that you can flexibly allocate them, so that you can actually respond to changing conditions. So this is it's central to ecosystem-based management, is to create that, because it creates assurances, both for the stakeholders, the water user community, and the agencies themselves, saying, this is your budget. This is what we've got. Let's do the best job we can. And the way to do the best job is to move away from the way we currently do things, which is to set minimum in-stream flow and water quality standards. That is the best way to flatline the environment that I can think of. And a flatline environment is not California's environment. I mean, we are so variable in space and time, and all the biology is adapted to that variability. The only way you're going to reintroduce variability is to do something which allows some flexibility. And that's why we're proposing this notion that many have heard about this, functional flows. We're going to be tackling that this year and doing a better description of what we mean by functional flows. But essentially what you're trying to do is allocate ecosystem water budgets and to strategically allocate them to create ecosystem function. And to do that well, you're going to have to reunite the land and the water. And so that's the structural habitat investments that have to be paired with the allocation of these ecosystem water budgets. That way you get the highest return on investment. No big change here. If you're trying to support anadromy, for example, in a system, or you're worried about it, a whole lot of warm green water is not going to make things better. Okay, so you have to really pay attention to water quality while you're paying attention to volume. This is not news to anybody in this room. I have been explaining to people, we are in the business of now actively managing species for the rest of forever here in California. As long as we care about species, we will be actively managing them. Everything from the way we manage harvest, the way we manage hatcheries, the way we manage non-native species, invasive non-native species. We are going to be involved in management for the rest of forever, unless you're going to take down all the dams. It's unlikely you're going to get to fully sustainable populations. In most cases, you will be involved in managing it. And then finally, manage at the appropriate scale. I know I insult half the people in this room, which has been my nature, who are working on pilot projects, or they're doing ecosystem restoration projects that I have dismissed as gardening projects because they're too small. They're not operating at the scale that ecosystems function at. And if we're going to believe in an ecosystem-based management, we have to get to scale. And the most common scale is the watershed itself. So the question that comes up is, okay, this is fine, Jeff, ecosystem-based management. This is legal? Doesn't it just sound like you're going to ignore the Endangered Species Act? We make it perfectly clear throughout the report, no. What we're trying to do is basically sweep these multiple and disparate regulatory objectives under one umbrella. And that's what ecosystem-based management is doing. And what we think in our report, again, the details are here, and the Q&A, we can get at it, more details, is that we already have the laws in place to do this. And the dominant law is the Clean Water Act and the Porter Cologne Act. Those laws grant the State Water Board exceptional authorities and the ability to actually take this approach. And this is a point we make strongly in the paper, that their ability there, these are abilities they have not taken advantage of. And they're reluctant to for lots of reasons. And they were very good about this when we talked to them about it. But between the Clean Water Act, the Porter Cologne Act, and public trust and reasonable use, the authorities of the board are so large. And in fact, the mandates of those, both the Porter Cologne Act and public trust and reasonable use, are for ecosystem-based management. That is the balancing of the use of water for the various uses, public trust and reasonable use. But what about the ESAs? Because that's the showstopper, right? I mean, if you're involved in projects wherever, oh my God, we've got a listed species. We also argue that state and federal agencies that administer these species these acts administer them in a very narrow way, that there's a lot of flexibility built into these acts so that you can take a broader approach and you can integrate human uses within your activities. And of course, at the top of the list are habitat conservation plans and the Natural Communities Conservation Program. Now, it turns out these allow you to take a much more take an ecosystem approach, not ecosystem-based. Ecosystem-based fully integrates human needs into your planning, but they are broad. And we're going to hear from Heather Dyer in particular about one program I'm very excited about, the Upper Santa Ana River Watershed, that you all should take a look at this coming year to see how to actually do this and do it under an HCP. Why didn't they do it in NCCP? I'm going to let her tell you, but I can tell you why they didn't do it elsewhere. It's too hard. This is probably a place where we could use some reform to make NCCPs easier to do. There are also a broad array of other laws that apply to this, but the conclusion of our legal team, notice I just offloaded all responsibility to them. The conclusion of our legal team is that not only is this permissible within the existing laws, it's actually encouraged by existing laws, that we take that approach. We are not inventing something new. We're already doing it in many areas. In the report, we've profiled 12 different programs. One of them you're going to hear from Heather, for example, and another one you'll hear from one that Allie Forsythe ran on the San Joaquin River. And Lester has been involved in everything in some way, shape, or form over the years. We're already taking on aspects of this where it's multi-benefit management, multi-species management. It's just all over the map and invented every time on its own. It comes up usually driven by either lawsuits or basically trying to meet regulatory requirements. Two exceptions to that are two plans that don't get enough credit for doing this. And one is the Delta Plan. And the Delta Plan itself is an ecosystem-based plan when you look at it. It is not narrowly focused on listed species. And the other is the State Flood Plan, Central Valley Flood Plan. It's really quite an extraordinary document if you wade through it. It's quite long. So it's the Delta Plan for that matter. And what you see is they've got strong elements of ecosystem-based management. So we're already doing it. What you need to do is find a way to kickstart it and to organize it. So in this, we make two proposals, and this is the first: incentivize this. And the way to incentivize this, building on our earlier work that we did back in 2017, is you got to have plans. But plans don't just well up out of nothing. You need a carrot and stick kind of approach to plans. You need somebody in charge of it. And with those broad authorities that the State Water Board has, and it did, again, I want to emphasize, they have much broader authorities than they currently take advantage of, they should establish the criteria. They should be very clear up front what these plans would be, what they would look like, what the narrative objectives are. And they should encourage comprehensive agreements. We're all watching what's going on. Those of you who are Delta watchers are watching the voluntary agreements, and we call them comprehensive agreements because we like that term a little better than voluntary agreements. These are binding agreements, and they're going to produce plans that are messy and wildly imperfect. So they have to build in the ability to adjust course as they go because they are ultimately a compromise in the process. But it is the most efficient way to get there quicker instead of spending all your time in court fighting over these things. But to make this successful, the State Board has to put some regulatory backstop. They got to get to stiffen everybody. They have to be tough. And that toughness is that if you all don't do this and you don't do it on time, here's what the consequences are. We saw a little of that on the San Joaquin River about a year ago, but that would be the only way to make this work is there's got to be a regulatory backstop. And then the goal is to adopt these as water quality control plans, so they have the force of law and regulation in California. So that's one way, and we're going to hear a little bit about the Upper Santa Ana River the HCP today in our panel. The other is to make them do it. And we'd have, for better or for worse, the most successful, maybe successful, we don't know yet, model, and that's the 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So you could do the same thing that they did with SGMA and do it with watersheds. And you could define what the critical watersheds are, give the state board the authority. If people don't self-organize and produce these sustainable watershed plans, basically your backstop is the state board imposes one on them. So we think that would be the other option, is to do that. And we know that for some people that is like the least popular option of all. But you may have to do it in some critical watersheds. So finally, let me sum up by saying we think this is a better approach. Right now, relying on Endangered Species Act as your primary environmental lever is not going to work. For one, I do want to tell you, there's an ever-growing body of research which is starting to say that the narrow focus on critical habitat, for example, isn't working well, that you need diverse, complex, varying ecosystems to actually recover these species. Okay, so that our old approach may not be working. But this is the only way that I can think of for us to anticipate and reduce new listings and future disruptions, particularly since we're in a rapidly changing climate. We need a better way to integrate human uses of the ecosystem into our thinking and planning, and to get away from this binary fish versus farms kind of approach. And then finally, the most important thing, we need something for the agencies to align under. We are inventing policy on an ad hoc basis in every watershed. We should have a way to align agency actions. So with that, I want to wrap up. Now, I'm going to be available for questions at the end of this, and I want to call our panelists to come up because my timekeeper says it's time. Carlos. And by the way, before I get to that, I do want to thank the PPIC staff led by Carlos Torres here for putting this together and feeding you a nice lunch. In fact, let's applaud them now. Thanks for lunch. So, this is Letitia Grenier, who's with the who's San Francisco Estuary Institute and was one of the co-authors on the paper, a landscape ecologist of extraordinary technical skill and ability, and she's going to run this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Really excited to get into the panel. Tell you a little bit about these folks first. So, as Jeff said, we had a large author group on the report, and these people are people who are actually doing this kind of work, kind of inventing it, as Jeff was describing, on the ground in the real world. So I think they're going to have a great perspective on some of the ideas that we wrote. Let me introduce them. Heather comes from a background in biology, but I think it's very cool that she has an executive MBA, which as a biologist I think is a good thing to have. She's working on the Upper Santa Ana River HCP. So as Jeff described, there's a real world example of trying to balance a lot of different needs and come up with a solution to actually manage an ecosystem. Next, we have Lester Snow, who's had many different roles in governing water, local, state, and federal. Today, he's representing the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, working on dam decommissioning, but he's held positions like California Secretary of Natural Resources. And finally, we have Ali Forsythe. Ali used to run the San Joaquin River Restoration Project, which was the largest federal river restoration in our country. And now she's working on the site's Reservoir Project, which is really interesting because the idea is to have a reservoir that includes ecosystem needs. So again, balances a lot of needs of water right from the beginning planning stages. So thank you so much all for being here. And very briefly, I just want to give you my perspective on this, which is that I'm really excited about this paper because I think the way that we are trained and the way that we work and the way that we get siloed and as Jeff was describing, is really frustrating because what we're working on here are systems. Really big, complex systems, that's what watersheds are, and the freshwater ecosystems that reside within them. And they have multiple inputs and multiple outputs. And so I feel like the way that we're running our freshwater ecosystems in California is like we have different groups and we're all trying to design the same car. And my team is making the car really fast. Your team on this side of the room wants it to be super efficient, lots of miles per gallon. And your team wants to have really low emissions. So I designed a sports car, you designed a diesel, and you designed a hybrid. And the car does not run. The car does not work like that. We all have to see the whole car to be able to design it. We all have to see the whole freshwater ecosystem to be able to maximize those benefits or functions or services that come out of the system. So if we want our systems to give us what we want, which to me is the definition of ecosystem health, if our freshwater ecosystems were really healthy, they'd be doing all the things they want. They'd be delivering reliable water. We'd have flourishing endangered species and lots of native biodiversity, and people would be recreating in them. It would be wonderful. Maybe we could get closer to that if we can think about running these systems as systems, because as Jeff said, they are all highly managed and they pretty much always will be. So let's acknowledge that and start to work together in a different way. All right, without further ado, let's talk to people who actually know how to do that and have struggled with that in the real world. I'm going to basically ask 2 rounds of questions, so we'll hear from everybody 2 times, and then I'll turn it over to you for your questions. So my first question is really about, with the great experience we have right here with these folks, and I do invite you to look at their bios, which are on the back of your agendas if you want to know more about the depth of the experience up here. With all the experience we have with these folks, what can they tell us about this idea of ecosystem-based management? And so I have specific questions for each person. I'm going to start with Ali. So thinking back to the San Joaquin River restoration, how did that inform your view of ecosystem-based management? If that was the approach taken, how would it have changed management or improve outcomes?
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I just want to make a quick thank you to PPIC and the team at PPIC. The work that you guys do is outstanding and really helps us further our policy in California. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the hard work that you do for the state. Much appreciated. So a little bit about the San Joaquin River Restoration Program and kind of the foundation of the program will help us in this discussion. The San Joaquin River Restoration Program was born out of 18 years of litigation. It's really a program that looks to restore and maintain naturally reproducing, self-sustaining populations of salmon and other fish in 153 miles of the San Joaquin River, really from Fresno down to the Merced River confluence. The goal in the program was really fish-based and really spring run Chinook based. So the program was given an allocation of water. The water users agreed to actually give that up in the settlement, about 20%, just shy of 20% of their actual supply. Each year, the program had an allocation of water that was allocated first to the program, whatever was after. It was based on inflow in the in the watershed, but whatever was after that was then allocated to the water users. And it could be scheduled throughout the year. So when we really talk about a dedicated amount of water for the environment, the restoration program has that. It allows for carryover that water within the year from season to season, scheduling of that water. We set up really quite an elaborate structure to schedule that water for the year, but then also change that schedule on a monthly, weekly, and even daily basis so that we were working to try and meet the needs, the ecosystem needs in the San Joaquin River as those arose. So if temperatures spiked downriver, trying to release water from Millerton quickly to get that water to move downriver just as soon as possible to help with spring run Chinook migration, or either in migration or out migration. So really very fish focused, but of course adding water back to a river and re-wetting a river that was dry for over 60 years has pretty broad ecosystem benefits. So lots of aquatic benefits to the aquatic ecosystem, to the riparian ecosystem. Really, once we started re-wetting the river and sending those initial flows down, just saw an incredible rebound of the riparian vegetation along the river. Just really, really neat components of all of that from the river perspective. We also had a lot of structural habitat work, so reshaping a river channel that hadn't had water in it for 60 years. A lot of setback levees, fish screens, a whole number of fish ladders and bypass systems to allow fish to navigate through the system. So it included that structural component to it and a quite robust science program. We always kind of struggled with getting our science in timely enough to actually make management decisions on it, but started holding an annual science workshop and really trying to get that science in quickly so that we can make management and flow decisions with it. The one component about the program that does start to kind of bridge a little bit in some of the challenges of ecosystem-based management is we had a number of agencies involved that really all had different missions. And so bringing them all together was complicated and challenging, and our authorities were all different. So I recognized that the San Joaquin River had broad social changes in the San Joaquin Valley on how people viewed the river system, going from a nuisance to really a resource for the local communities, a resource for especially a lot of the low-income populations in the San Joaquin Valley. Having water back in a river provided a great opportunity to connect the population back with the river. Reclamation, we wanted to fund a kids camp and bring kids out to the river down in Firebaugh in a very low-income community, but I was told by the solicitor's office I didn't have the legal authority to do that. So this is where you really have to bring your partners in together to see who else can do that and who else actually has the authority, can find the funding to make those things work, to bring this whole thing together. In terms of what are changes or improvements, or could the program have been different if we had really incorporated in ecosystem-based management from the start? I think it could have. It's a very fish-based program, really a very spring run Chinook based program. Of course, that has broad benefits, but it is very focused on that singular species, and the rest of the benefits are more ancillary for that. I will say, though, that the program being born out of 18 years of litigation, there were many times when I wasn't sure we were gonna be able to hold it together, just as it was, and so trying to incorporate much broader goals into it. I'm not sure that the parties really had the capacity and had built the trust to be able to do that early on. Although I look at it today and I say the opportunity is there today because Freshwater Authority, Natural Resources Defense Council is kind of the lead for the NGO community, along with the Bay Institute, have really built a tremendous trust and relationships between them that I think it is possible to take the program now and really incorporate in the ecosystem-based management components that are missing from it and take it further than what it would do otherwise.
That is so interesting to hear you say that. The opportunity is there today. I think that's a key idea, that once you've built these foundations of cooperative working together in the relationships, that is something that you can then push forward into, fleshing out the other parts of ecosystem-based management that you might want. And so you've already maybe done some of the hardest heavy lifting on that particular project.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lester, I'm curious from your perspective, now you're working on dam removal, which seems like it should be a great thing for the ecosystem. How does that fit in with ecosystem-based management? Does that create greater net gains in terms of services and desired functions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Walk through just a little bit of history of that project. First, though, I want to compliment. I think this is an absolutely excellent report and at the right time. Now, the value of this report will deteriorate quickly unless we pick it up as a community and have that robust discussion, debate to move forward on how you implement it. And also I want to mention, this may be the only time that I nodded to everything that Jeff said in his overview, and not likely to happen again. I'm just saying, there's no promises there. Let me start with the Klamath, and then just a few other quick observations. There's really no question when you look at the Klamath Basin that an ecosystem-based approach, is where we need to be. It's a large basin. You have a lot of issues going on in that basin. The current effort with the Klamath River Renewal Corporation is not the whole basin. It's not the whole ecosystem. The very narrow job of KRRC, the nonprofit corporation, is to remove 4 dams and restore under the footprint of the existing reservoirs. And it should be larger. And so let me describe how we got to this point. Some of you may recall something called the KBRA, and that was the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement. I think it was agreement. Let's just say KBRA. Well, that was signed in 2010, resulting from negotiations in starting in 2006 over relicensing. And so it dealt with issues in the upper basin. It dealt with tribal land issues of returning some land to especially the Klamath tribes. It dealt with water quality issues both above Klamath Lake as well as in the river, water supply reliability for the irrigators. It was a very broad plan. Unfortunately, it needed Congress to weigh in. And there was a deadline in KBRA of 2015 for Congress to act. They did not. And so what happened is that many of the parties, many of the original signatories, regrouped and resurrected the KHSA, the Klamath Hydropower Settlement Agreement. So that's the dam removal. But it left behind all of those other issues that any of us would include in an ecosystem-based management approach to the Klamath. Now, there is hope of recapturing that. There's a guy by the name of Alan Mickelson from Interior who's been working with the tribes and the other parties in a painfully slow process to try to grab that. But having said that, we think an anchor to anything else that you would do would be a healthy river. And we do not have a healthy river at the moment. And so removing the dams deals with water quality. It deals with endangered species habitat and non-endangered species habitat. Opens up 400 miles of additional spawning habitat. Also, not something that's typically included in a discussion like this, it deals with what I consider to be social obligations to the tribes that were deprived of cultural resources for over 100 years because of this. So there's a lot of benefit that comes from it, but there has to be another step to deal with the broader issues in the basin. It does highlight the institutional complexity, because in that case, we're 13 years into discussion. And if we hit our target with breaching the dams, we'll be 16 years and maybe longer. So it's these lead times that I think are killing us. Broader time frame, or the broader framing for me on this topic, and this is, if any of you listen to me anytime, hardly anybody does, but you know, I throw things out every once in a while. I continue to believe that climate change and the change of our natural resource system is moving faster than we are responding. Mm-hmm. And that applies to water supply reliability, and it applies to ecosystem health. And we have to move fast. We cannot have 2 decades of litigation, negotiation to address a problem that's actually critical today. And that leads to looking at how we implement the essence of this report. A final thing that I'll say, I'm also known for kind of bad analogies, but in healthcare, we spend 30% of our healthcare costs in the last year of our lives. And numbers vary a little bit, but it's something like 90% in the last 10% of our lives. Sometimes that's what ESA looks like to me, especially in the aquatic environment. Mm-hmm. We're spending massive amount of money to barely keep a species alive, versus in the healthcare business, and if you follow this, a lot of interest in functional medicine, which is focused on preventive care, eating better, nutrition, and avoiding some of these catastrophic things later in life. And I think what we're talking about here is preventive ecosystem management, but we've got to get out in front of these issues. So I have other thoughts for the next question, perhaps.
Okay. We look forward to those. I really like that analogy about healthcare. The thing that it makes me think is that my pet peeve about the ESA is that it's focused on that small population paradigm. Let's squeeze things down to the minimum and then like barely keep them going, which is just not the right way to do it. The only thing I'd say about that's not how biology works. Obviously, there's ups and downs, and you need to have way bigger buffers around those population sizes. But the ESA doesn't say we can't do it that way. So we can focus on having thriving wildlife populations. We don't have to manage toward the small population paradigm. Just want to point that out. Heather, so in your more urban setting where you're working, can you give examples of better synergies or outcomes that have come out of your, I'm going to call it a quasi-ecosystem-based management approach?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I'm a former federal regulator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so I wanted to say something about the ESA. So a lot of people don't realize that almost all of the workload planning and budget for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is driven by litigation. So that's how they distribute their funds and their staff time, and very little is left over to write recovery plans or implement any of the actions that do make it into a recovery plan. So I really look at the ESA as it is a fundamental part of this equation. I look at it as the purse strings, the wallet for recovery, as a tool in the toolbox that if we can come up with these watershed plans that say if we're going to restore a watershed or species, we're going to lay it all out, we're going to figure out the plan, then we go to the permittees within a HCP or even just Section 7 consultations, and we start drawing from that plan in order to implement recovery actions. And so I think it's a fundamental part of the equation that if we can get this planning started, then the ESA can become a real driver for recovery, which on their own, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will never have enough money to recover species. They're in reaction mode. We need other partners to be proactive in recovering species. So wanted to get that out there on the ESA, which I love, by the way. I'm probably one of the only ESA nerds in the world that really love it. But our plan was, so if any of you ever been to the Santa Ana River, it's highly urbanized. There's millions and millions of miles, it seems like, of concrete lined channels, freeway overpasses, storm drains that are the only source of water for some of our species. The other source of water being, wastewater that's discharged to the river. So there's barely anything natural about the Santa Ana River anymore, with the exception of the entire river is not concrete like the LA River. We have healthy, functioning riparian systems. And so our plan was also driven out of litigation. My general manager, he talks about they had to go through several phases. The first was denial. Then it was anger. The ESA is hard to understand for a lot of public agencies. And so, we tried to fight it in court over one particular species, went all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. And at that time, I was the regulator for this group. And I'm sitting across the table and telling the group, even if you win this critical habitat lawsuit, you didn't solve your problem. You still do not have enough fish in order to get an incidental take permit. And that was a really big wake-up call, I would say. And luckily, my general manager at the time, he was very proactive in trying to come up with a parallel path that we could take to help recover this species, which then turned into 22 different species in the watershed, but a way to work as a partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service in order to get the take permits needed for our water supply projects. We have a lot of hurdles in this very urbanized system, one of them just being there's not enough water. So we had to start at the very beginning where what are the habitat criteria that we are trying to build? Where are we going to get enough water to do that? How are the 11 partners that co-fund this plan, how are we going to be able to make each other whole? So our plan is actually based on a really, what I think is a groundbreaking paradigm of the 11 agencies that work on this plan. We all come to the table with something. Some of us have water, some of us have money, some of us have land. And we tried to take the boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, geographic boundaries, whatever it might be, that usually dictates, well, we can't because. We took that all away. We said to our partners, okay, we need this amount of water in this location for these fish. Who can put it there? And one of our partners could put it there, and then all the other partners make that partner whole. And what I mean by that is, so we have a few locations where more water does not make more fish. So through these partnerships, we were able to reroute water through a pipe. Now, there's nothing natural about this, I fully admit. We put water through a pipe, we discharge it into these streams that we're restoring. The public utility who supplies that water, that is part of their water supply program, right? So they want to be compensated somehow. So the other partners, we get together and we put water where that public utility needs water above their municipal wells. And that's what I mean by we make each other whole. And so by that cooperation, that collaborative approach to solving problems, we've really been able to make a difference in coming up with a holistic watershed-based strategy that covers all the different life history stages, the whole geographic range of within our watershed of this one species, Santa Ana sucker, and we've tried to capture every element of what it means to try to reach recovery. And it would not be possible without the partnerships. There's no doubt about it. It's too big, too expensive, too complex for one agency to do it on its own. But if you work together and you have this relationship, again, like Ali said, these relationships based on mutual trust and respect for everyone's mission, it is possible. And we've made a lot of progress in what I would say is a short amount of time in very challenging circumstances.
That's great to hear. I think those trade-offs that you're talking about, you're taking something that's less valuable and moving it and then compensating in another place, in a place where it's more valuable, is a really great insight into how this sausage can be made. All right, I'm going to move on to our second question, which is about, okay, so you guys have a lot of experience to bring to this question. How would you do it now? Essentially, how would you bring that experience to bear on actually implementing some ecosystem-based management? So this time I'm going to start with you, Heather. How could other people do this in other urban settings? So urban places are maybe some of our most challenging places in terms of having a healthy environment or having an ecosystem that provides the things that people want it to provide. How would you improve on the HCP approach, or would you recommend that for other areas?
I do recommend the HCP approach, primarily because it is the way that you get many partners to the table for the exact reason that I just described. In most instances, one agency will not be able to make meaningful recovery actions for a species. It is that piecemeal. If it's through one biological opinion or 10 biological opinions, it usually is not planned out in a way that it can make a very robust conservation strategy. So I really think that regional habitat conservation plans are the way to go, even if you have the ability to go through the Section 7 process of the ESA. Almost every single one of our 74 covered activities needs a core permit. We could have done it on a project-by-project basis. Legally, the tool is there. However, those 74 projects would not have been working off of the same conservation plan, and so wouldn't have had the same meaning to the species and to basically reach that threshold that we needed to avoid a jeopardy biological opinion for any one of those projects. One thing that's important about our plan, so our plan is permitting over 50 years, approximately 80,000 acre feet per year of new local water supply. We're a state water contractor. We bring about 100,000 acre feet per year from Northern California. So by supplementing this within our water portfolio, it makes us a lot more resilient and able to cope with future climate change that we know we're facing. And so it was really important for us to be able to build these water supply projects. But if we would have done it on a project-by-project basis, there was this feeling of everyone's racing to be the one non-jeopardy biological opinion that's going to get issued on these species. And so sometimes it comes out of your back is against the wall and you have to come up with something that is really challenging, and it does seem insurmountable at times. But if you get all of the right people around the table from all perspectives, you can create these synergies and really kind of build off of what everyone has to offer. I would highly recommend, if anyone else contemplates doing this as a watershed or a river system, or even, just many projects within a large regional scale, that you bring the regulators from all the agencies into the room at the same time and you find out, what is your objective? What do you need out of this process? Same for the water agencies or the cities or whoever it might be. Even the NGOs. I have Center for Biological Diversity and Endangered Habitat League at almost every single one of my meetings. And so by having that open dialogue, it's really helpful to get a process started that you work through over the years of planning. So in the end, everyone knows what they're getting out of it.
That's really, really interesting and helpful to hear that. I hear some really key ideas. It has to be large enough scale. You have to have the full system there, but you're not just saying the full environmental system, the full people system. You have to get everybody at the table, include the regulators, bring people along, build that trust.
I like to refer to it as you want to be planning on a landscape level, but not just geographic landscape scale, the full regulatory landscape that you are going to have to move through.
It's a very helpful idea. Everyone take a note. All right, we'll move on to Allie. We're going to talk a little bit about the sites reservoir, which you're planning right now. It's intended, I believe, to balance multiple objectives from the start and include these ecosystem water budgets. Is that a good currency for ecosystem-based management?
I really think it is. So we need to start thinking about our ecosystems differently. And my eyes were really open to this on the San Joaquin River when we were able to actually have an allocation of water to manage for the environment, and could schedule that water when the environment needed it, could carry it from season to season. It had a great amount of flexibility and opportunity to really target that water for very specific environmental needs in the river. And I think we need to start thinking about our freshwater ecosystems in that way. How do we dedicate water to our freshwater ecosystems? How do we create a toolbox of assets that allow storage and carryover of ecosystem water and allow for exchanges, transfers, releases of that water into very pointed areas that provide ecosystem benefits as they're actually occurring. So instead of just having opportunistic releases when Mother Nature provides for extra water in the system, how do we control and manage that water and release it for very specific purposes? And sites has the opportunity to do that. That's something that has been very important to the sites board of directors and the member agencies is environmental and ecosystem benefits for the project. Up to half of the water out of sites could go for environmental benefits, subject to WISIP and what the federal government would be interested in buying into for. But we're looking at treating that water, the environmental water, no different than how we would manage that for our partners. So the environmental water, whether it's the state would control the WISIP water and potentially reclamation would control the federal component. But they would be able to schedule their water just as a water user would, change their schedule on a monthly, weekly, daily basis, be able to carry water over in sites from season to season, year to year. And so it's providing both a water asset, but also a storage asset. How do we get storage for the environment so that we can take some of that wet year water that's plentiful and hold it for 2014, 2015 years when the species really critically need it. The interesting part about sites too and being able to allow the environment to manage the water in this way is the asset can also be, and I know this is a bad word for a lot of folks, but it can be monetized. So the environment needs funds to make water release out of Folsom because of a need there. It could potentially sell water out of sites, generate those dollars to release water out of Folsom. It can also do that on a trade or exchange. So say, for example, there's not, the environmental account hasn't been full at sites. There's still storage left. It could lease that storage to another water user within the site's framework. So you could lease it for money, you could lease it for water. So I'll lease you 10,000 acre feet of storage. If 2 years from now you give me 2,000 acre feet of water back. So it creates this, it puts the environment on an equal playing field with our water users, and they're able to play in the water market and be able to move water around in a way that is very flexible, very opportunistic, very targeted for those environmental needs rather than just, here's water from a flood release and that's all the environment gets for the year. So we're really looking at sites and how do we create a structure that would allow for tremendous flexibility for the environment to be very focused, very strategic in helping the environment for now and definitely for into the future.
Yeah, Heather wants to add to that.
So I just wanted to comment on, Allie talking about having the environmental water be an equal partner. So in order to make this possible, there needs to be kind of an eye-opening for our regulatory agencies. They have never really, if you're a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fisheries biologist and you're writing biological opinions, you are regulating to prevent extinction. The balance you're trying to find is this a jeopardy or non-jeopardy, right? By having this environmental water there available for the regulating agencies to use as needed to promote recovery of their species, they need to understand what that means, that I need to figure out how should this be released for environmental benefits? When is the best time? And where are the locations that we need to release it from for different life stages or whatever their species might need? And that's a fundamental shift in regulatory thinking at the fisheries agencies especially. And so that's a process that we're going through. We've been doing it in Southern California. When I first started talking about moving water around for fisheries, they said, you can do that? And we're like, yes, there's like 1 million miles of pipelines. So we could just put pipes places. You can do in lieu trades. Sites Reservoir is a perfect example of if we take those false boundaries off of maps and we say, in these 4 locations, we need water of this temperature or this turbidity, who can get it there? And then all the other agencies say, okay, well, we'll replace your water in lieu that you release for the fish. We'll replace it through these other, dam holdings or, whatever it might be. Like, we're all in the same community. So we all have the ability to make these deals and fit the puzzle pieces together so that it benefits the environment and the fish, which then benefits the water agencies, because the more fish we have, the easier our job is to get permits and, do our job of supplying water to the public.
Absolutely.
That's such a great dialogue. I really love understanding how ecosystem water budgets can work. Seeing that the environment has a seat at the table equal to the other water users is this really powerful tool in the toolbox. And then that can get us out of the small population paradigm into a different kind of regulatory thinking about how do I actually get this population to thrive. So that's very heartening because I feel like we don't hear stories like that a lot. So thank you both very much. Last question is going to be for Lester. Given all your different angles of experience on this, understanding state, local, and federal management and regulation, is there an institutional structure or an approach to collaboration that you would recommend to actually try to implement ecosystem-based management?
Yes.
What is it?
First, I want to say, given the last part of the discussion here, I mean, just this concept of building some creativity into what is otherwise a regulatory process. And too often, a regulatory process it doesn't have room for exploration. Is there a better way to do this? And I think that's essential. And so one of the questions is, can you do that without some statutory or financial arrangements? And I doubt that. But let me back up a little bit. And some of my experience on what can be done. I go back to the 2006 floods. Some of you may remember that, and that was before we used atmospheric rivers as a phrase, and I think we called it a Pineapple Express. It started at the end of December, and then several more runs at it in January, just massive flooding all through the Central Valley. and a lot of flood fights. But one of the bigger issues that came out of it, the levees that didn't fail nearly failed. And so it's massive erosion, and there was a great concern if you didn't fix those levees, the next season, if you had even modest flooding, you were going to have large-scale flooding and property damage. And so as a result of that, there actually was a regulatory kind of permit coordination effort, because you had multiple endangered species that you were dealing with. And riprap in one area might be a good idea, but then you're going to lose the trees that provide shading and cover for, some of you know the drill on that one. So there actually was an effort, I think it was actually weekly meetings with NIMS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game at the time. I think there are other parties, might have even had GS and the Corps at different times, although Corps was never a creative partner on this. Who's shocked? I don't know. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. And it worked very well to try to deal with both the vegetation issue and the windows of construction issues, and moved very quickly, not sequentially from one agency to another, but as a team review of it. But one of the things that made it work is you had very high level commitment from all of those agencies. And then over time, as the pressure came off, that kind of coordination moved down in the organization, and people less able to make commitments in a meeting. And so you saw a flash when it was needed of that kind of one-stop shopping, as it were, to approve projects. And then we kind of moved back to an older system, although probably improved. So I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory silos and the, when it's not just, it's management silos, and some of them are regulatory. And there's a couple ways to approach it. And one is an administrative approach, and you're not really dealing with, I'll call it the organic legislation that puts them on their way. And so I think, there's some discussion of having a coordination office, where you actually have an office of ecosystem-based management. And so you have the state board, you have Fish and Wildlife, you have Department of Water Resources, you have different entities whose job it is to make it happen. Not to review it and tell you can't do it, but to make it happen, and to be able to do the planning and permitting as a state supporting those kinds of activities. The other is a cultural issue, and so this is old, and Heather may have a different an update on this, but I go back to when Secretary Babbitt really tried to push Section 10, because there was in Congress some assault on ESA. It doesn't work. It's stopping too many economic projects, and they really started to push that. Well, within the Fish and Wildlife Service, there was real pushback. There were people that didn't believe that Section 10 was to be used. You go after that species and you do everything to protect it. And that has changed. It really changed on the terrestrial front. Stevens kangaroo rat. I'm sure everybody's got a poster of a Stevens kangaroo rat. At least Bell's Vireo in Southern California, big terrestrial approaches that were quite successful. And so I think there has to be focus on what can you do administratively to support the kinds of things that have been discussed here today. Statutorily, I happen to think that ultimately, to increase the speed and get out in front of climate change, we need changes in authorities and requirements. HCP should not be an option. It should be how we approach these different issues. I am not one, and I'm going to put an asterisk on this, to believe that 46 years ago we had divine guidance that gave us the best law that could ever be written to protect species. Doesn't happen, but that's the way we act right now, out of political fear. And in this current political environment, I'm not proposing anybody move forward with the ESA amendment anytime soon. But I think we have to take a critical look at what can be done by rational people to improve implementing ESA, but on the broader scale. not chasing the last species that you may not be able to save, but rather chase the ecosystem that will keep other species from falling into that category. And I guess I'm saying within that, a better way to allow trade-offs and to allow investments not just to go to that incidental take permit, but to go to the ecosystem. And I'm not sure you can do that effectively without some statutory support. And then that goes to, coordinated permitting and assistance to reduce transaction costs associated with getting these kind of projects moving forward. And one of the things that Jeff raised was moving to scale. And again, this comes from my paranoia about how rapidly our environment is changing because of climate change. And you can't have these decades of litigation that finally lead you to a table where you then have a decade to start implementing a comprehensive program. We've got to figure out how we move to scale more quickly. Final thing I guess I'll say, and part of moving to scale for me is considering legislation about authorities. How do you make certain difficult decisions? But it's also about money. And again, the point, a lot of your ESA implementers have no money to get out in front of an issue. And I can remember at the Bureau working with Fish and Wildlife Service, which I really enjoyed. It's just top quality people. Just the tension between the hatchery folks, the refuge folks, and the ESA folks. And even within ESA, kind of some dispute of how you take limited dollars and what do you do with them. And we've got to have more money involved in that. And the final thing I'll say that's also related to money is that too often to fix our ecosystem, we're dependent on somebody who's got a project they want to do. Mm-hmm. How's that work? I mean, there's clearly benefits that will happen with a site's reservoir, and the ecosystem will be healthier because of that. What happens if the proponents pull the plug on it? Then we're just out those things. We've got to do a better job of funding those kinds of activities. And granted, there are some public funds that are geared to public benefits in that, but not in other cases. So we've got to get out in front of this. We have to pay, and that's one of the problems probably everybody here has experienced. We want a better world. We just don't want to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get past that and invest in these things and take a deep breath and look at statutory changes that we may need. Thanks.
Thank you, that's great. I really think that idea of speed is a key one, and it seems to me that taking what you've all said together, it's these more flexible agreements that can allow us to bring together partners with money, do the trade-offs, and come up with a creative solution. So I can see why that's sort of highlighted in the paper as the way to do this fast enough. All right, the time has come when we can hear from everybody in the audience. Please indicate by standing up or raising your hand that you'd like to ask a question, and then wait for a microphone to come to you. A couple people in the middle. Microphones are coming.
Okay, I was just curious, freshwater, how much of this involves estuaries along the coastline? Is this a big issue with you? Of course, the Delta is a big example of the ocean meeting freshwater, but preserving estuaries, and I think of money meaning action, and Howard Hughes had a great area called Bologna Creek, which he developed into a small settlement called Marina del Rey. How are you able to attack this? Do you work with the Coastal Commission? How do you come up with formidable opponents like that?
So the Upper Santa Ana River Plan purposely does not go to the coast for some of those very reasons. We actually end our plan area at a major dam called Prado Dam, which leads into Orange County. The two primary drivers behind making that decision, even though it would have made a more holistic plan from the ocean to the mountains, the whole watershed, was we didn't want to bring in another fisheries agency. So then we would have had National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Coastal Commission and all of the coastal interests that we just felt like it was too big of a barrier to try to get over to satisfy all interests. There has been talk about potentially expanding our plan down to the coast so that we could incorporate the entire watershed, but that's something that we would take on at a different point. But it's a very significant hurdle to get over.
I think it's definitely a balance. When I was in the San Joaquin program, I called it the Christmas tree. Everybody wants to hang their ornament on the Christmas tree. And you get so many ornaments on the tree, the branches break and it falls over, and the whole thing crumbles. And so we have to be careful in setting these up that we don't make them so big that they collapse under their own weight, or that they're so difficult to get congressional authorization or funding for in the case of KBRA. So it is definitely a balance, and I think it's really, someone who's interested in embarking on this, or an organization or agency, I think it's really just talking informally with the partners in the basin to see what's the temperament. What do other folks think? Are they willing to engage and help and move it along, or are you going to run into roadblock after roadblock that maybe the time isn't right and need to wait a little bit? I think it's very variable for every system, every ecosystem, every watershed.
I'll weigh in with my experience from the Bay Delta estuary. I think this 100% applies to the Delta, and that is half the estuary. On the Bay side, there is a lot of voluntary cooperation that's been happening for 20, 30 years, and that's created a huge momentum toward restoration. So it's not quite the same as a structured HCP with regulatory teeth behind it, but it has been really effective, and it's still based on creating relationships with trust and working together over essentially whole careers to get something done. Now, there's a problem. The Bay and the Delta kind of are separate and are in our minds and the way we manage them, but not in reality. I guess the last thing I'd say is, although our estuaries are really challenged in California in terms of both climate change and the way that freshwater is managed, it's higher in the watershed that at the moment is worse off ecologically. So I think focusing on freshwater is not a bad thing to do. Yeah. Anybody else? There's several people who are the.
This is probably.
Okay.
This is probably for the whole panel, but I guess anybody that wants to talk. But the report mentions two kind of approaches to implement, ecosystem-based management systems. Kind of the hands-off approach, where the water board just says, "Hey guys, let's get together, let's make this happen, incentivize them." The other option is for the legislature to come in with a hammer and pass a huge law. What do you think is more likely or more feasible approach to those recommendations?
Well, very quickly, I don't think it's either or. I think you have to do both. And the only modification I would make is it can't be a hammer. Maybe it's a rubber mallet. I mean, it can't be the heavy-handed approach, but it's maybe a little Sigma-esque. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, here's what you need to do, and if you don't, we'll probably do it. But there has to be incentives. Mm-hmm. I mean, there has to be regulatory timeline, reducing transaction costs, go to the front of the permitting line. I mean, there has to be, and ideally funding. Mm-hmm. There has to be incentives, but I do think there has to be a very clearly articulated reason to do it.
Yeah, I would say that the incentives have to be both financial in terms of planning money and also regulatory streamlining. So, they could say if you are part of an approved habitat conservation plan, that you get streamlined, expedited permitting for all your other permits that you need to get that's included in that plan. The other thing is the planning process on these is really difficult and expensive. So we spent about $5 million on planning so far, in order to implement approximately $50 million worth of conservation activities. So that's a huge benefit on the tail end, but it's getting that momentum to do all the science, to do all of the really detailed GIS mapping and all that kind of stuff. But the benefit for the public is there. You just have to get it started. And so I think for the incentives, those two things would be really helpful. Our water district, or actually our whole region, we're a fully adjudicated basin. And so we actually were excluded from SGMA. However, as a region, we went and asked permission, essentially, or we did it on our own, to develop what we call a Groundwater Sustainability Council. And I think that might be a good model for a process like this, where it's completely voluntary, but all of the entities within our service area got together and they said, we want to keep our groundwater basins whole. How do we work together to do that? And there's a cost associated with that. You know, it's not free. So everybody pays into it proportionally to what they get out of the groundwater basin. And so far it's worked, very well. And that was a completely voluntary process because we saw the long-term benefit. So I think, having stories like that where, maybe it's not a hammer, like you said, but there's incentives to do something like that could be really beneficial.
All right. There's someone in the way back who's had his hand up from the beginning.
Jeff, an advocate, but I hear a lot, and Southern California has made great efforts of conservation over the last 20 years. How do you restore the oversended groundwaters here in Northern California? What efforts have been made in that direction?
That sounds like one for you, Allie.
Well, I think it's complicated, and it's complicated between the Sacramento Valley, which has fairly decent groundwater system and has done a fairly good job of managing their groundwater, versus the San Joaquin Valley, which is much more challenging. I know the San Joaquin Valley is working hard on implementation of SGMA and getting together their plans down there, but we're looking at decades for restoring the groundwater basins. It's something that does affect these programs quite a bit. There's a very large subsidence area in the middle of the San Joaquin River that was frankly driving up the costs of the San Joaquin River Restoration Program and requiring us to put in a lot more robust infrastructure as the ground was sinking about a foot a year. Our fish ladders start to not perform quite well when the whole system is changing and your dynamics are changing. So it is a challenge very much in the San Joaquin Valley.
I might recommend you go to the PPIC website and look at their San Joaquin Valley report that deals with some of these issues, including all the way to land retirement, in order to balance the basin as well as recharge and other things. So it's probably the single best document I've seen that you could say is kind of a status of where we are right now.
We on the topic of conservation, we actually ran into some difficulties I was talking to Ellen about earlier, is that with the increased conservation during the drought especially, that meant decreased runoff, which was one of the primary supplies of water for our endangered fisheries in the river. We really only have wastewater effluent and urban runoff. And so we were starting to see the tributaries that were dependent upon runoff from parks and golf courses and that kind of thing go dry. So that's where this, collaborative approach to how do we get water, sustainable, reliable sources of water from our wastewater treatment plants into these streams that we're restoring, so that we know in the face of, long-term drought or more conservation, whatever it might be, that we will still have enough water to keep the river wet for these fish that we are trying to recover. But it's interesting because everyone wants people to conserve from a groundwater basin perspective. But if that's the only water you have going into a stream, then it causes, some tension. But I think we found a pretty good way of dealing with that.
Great. Any other questions from here?
Allie mentioned a situation where the science, you were struggling to get the science in time to inform the management decision. Could you talk more about what was going on?
Sure. So It takes a while to get all of the data together, to get the data analyzed, to get it out. And there's scientists are absolutely fabulous individuals. There's a lot of times when they want to hold on to that data until they can publish it. But I need the data to make a decision. And so we struggled with that a bit on the San Joaquin program of just getting the data and getting the analysis done quickly enough so that we can make some of the management decisions. Generally, we found that a lot of it was almost a year lagging behind, from our, so we couldn't make, with real-time monitoring system, like water temperature, real-time water temperature monitoring, real-time flow monitoring, we could make decisions on that. But if we were looking at science from, say, emergence of spring run from reds in the upper San Joaquin River system, we really had to wait a year to 2 years to get that data, get it all analyzed, to be able to make management decisions and how we would change flows based on that data. So it's an area that I think could use some improvement and really thinking about how we do that quicker. We did, and the restoration program is looking at building a real-time database that's web-based and GIS-based to really shorten up that time frame. But there's a tremendous amount of effort to make that happen.
Is it on the same topic? Okay.
And the comprehensive agreements, and this is for any of you who want to answer, given what Allie just described, I'm imagining you had some preliminary performance measures, but if you weren't able to get the data to inform the management action and you weren't meeting the performance measure, how did the partners resolve the unexpected or the not meeting the measure?
I am not involved in the comprehensive agreements enough to know the answer to that question. Is
I'm not.
anybody on the panel? Yeah, we might have to, maybe you and I can catch up later and I can give you a contact for someone that would help answer that question.
Although I can give an example of something where real-time sharing of data with our regulators really benefited. So we do annual surveys every year. This particular year, in the previously highest area of abundance for Santa Ana sucker, the only native fish we found were in the stomachs of largemouth bass. So we immediately went to our regulators and said, we really, really need to take drastic measures here or there's not going to be any fish next year. And so through that process of sharing our fish numbers and our data set, even though it hadn't been published, USGS was probably freaking out that I shared the numbers. But they took that as, basically an emergency that we needed to take action, and we were able to have a predator removal day where we took out, I think, something like 2,500 non-native predator fish. But it is really important in certain circumstances where you can make a quick management decision based on your data. So.
And I think that's the kind of quick action we're going to need to keep our populations going. That was a great example. John Calloway over here had a question. Is there a microphone in that area?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask about the performance measures and the metrics, because it seems like definitely all of us are interested in an ecosystem approach and not a single species approach, but how do we set up metrics that drive us in that direction? Because it seems like we always fall back on metrics that are species-based, and the metrics really need to push us to do ecosystem-based efforts.
Anyone?
Any insight from your previous project?
So it does get complicated, but in my mind, I think you get all of the interests in the room together, including the NGO community, and frankly, with what's going on in the Klamath Basin with Alan Mickelson's work, you bring in a lot of the human environment, so the business community into the room and have a robust dialogue to figure out what are those metrics. I think for a lot of us, our metrics are based around species because it's, for whatever reason, we're kind of species driven. But something like the work that's going on right now in the Klamath Basin is really bringing in a lot of the human component, both the business community but also the tribes. So I really think you bring the interest in the room together and have that dialogue.
We're trying to focus on healthy, functioning native communities. So, for instance, historically, Santa Ana sucker, Santa Ana speckled dace, and arroyo chub, probably mountain yellow-legged frog would have all co-occurred in certain streams. And so rather than just focusing on reestablishing, reintroducing Santa Ana sucker populations into these upper watershed streams, we're looking at how do we bring back, speckled dace and mountain yellow-legged frog and reestablish the community that would have been there. But then we also are taking into account, water quality, high flushing flows, base flow, riparian vegetation, bird communities, all those kinds of things. So when we present our objectives and our criteria for success, it will be based on an ecological community rather than, we need 100 Santa Ana sucker in this particular reach or something.
And I think functional flows are a good example of a process-based metric that's going to actually do a lot of good across other aspects of the ecosystem, moving sediment, water temperature, water quality, as well as supporting the fish that require certain cues. All right, I think we're out of time. So I first want to thank our panel. So helpful for you to come and share your experience. Thank you very much. And on behalf of PPIC and the authors of this paper, I want to thank all of you for coming and listening. And so now is the time to go and try to implement some ecosystem-based management. Remember, the door is still open to doing it on all of your projects. We heard that. We're going to spend earlier in the life cycle to have thriving populations of wildlife and healthy, happy people. And we're going to find a parallel path like Heather was talking about. If you'd like a physical copy of the report, remember they're back there at the desk where you checked in. Thank you so much.